Thousands of years ago, the kingdoms of Malava and Saurashtra were joined by the marriage of King Śikhidhvaja and Queen Cūḍālā. They were a devoted couple, initially united by a shared obsession with spiritual study and the pursuit of self-knowledge. Eventually, Cūḍālā turned her investigation inward. By asking the single question, "Who am I?" she arrived at a state of deep internal peace. She became a Jivan Mukti, one who is liberated while still living, all while maintaining her royal lifestyle and palace duties. Her internal shift manifested in physical mastery. By directing her inner energy, or Kundalini, she acquired the ability to fly, an expression of the Shakta Tantra traditions that shaped this text. Cūḍālā's progress suggested that spiritual authority is determined by the internal state and is independent of a person's environment or routine. Her husband looked at her peace and saw foolishness. He remained convinced that real dispassion could only be forged through physical suffering. Against his wife's advice, Śikhidhvaja abandoned his throne to become a hermit. He spent the next 18 years in a dense forest, living as an emaciated, miserable ascetic. This approach to spirituality is directly challenged by texts like the Ashtavakra Gita. It points instead to King Janaka, who remained a model of realization while seated firmly on his throne. These texts compare infinite consciousness to the vast sky, and the human ego to a clay pot trapping that space. Shattering the pot doesn't change the space inside. It remains contiguous with the infinite, regardless of the clay. Śikhidhvaja's flight to the forest was a trap because he had only changed his location. He had carried his unexamined ego, the pot, with him into the woods. For 18 years, Cūḍālā ruled the kingdom alone and without error. Her success proved that enlightenment is no hindrance to effective worldly action. When she finally visited her husband, she realized that his prejudices remained. He was still unable to accept spiritual instruction from a woman or from his own wife. Cūḍālā utilized her powers to transform her physical body, adopting the form of a young, authoritative male Brahmin named Kumbha. Scholars like Wendy Doniger and Tamara Cohen highlight how the text uses the rigid social categories of the time as a springboard for this role-playing. The narrative is clear. She has to become a man to teach him. This creates an irony that underscores the text's message. To teach the king that reality has no form, Cūḍālā must first adopt a culturally powerful form that the king is willing to respect. Kumbha confronted the king, using a story about a wish-fulfilling jewel called the Chintamani to expose the futility of the king's lifestyle. In the story, a man spends his life seeking a celestial jewel, but he eventually gives up and settles for a worthless piece of crystal instead. Kumbha applied this to Śikhidhvaja's life. The king had abandoned the joy of true realization in favor of the bitter, worthless crystal of forest asceticism. He told a parable of an elephant breaking from a heavy iron cage, only to fall into a blind pit. The cage represents the kingdom. The pit is asceticism. Steered by a rider called ignorance, the king was trapped in a new cage of suffering. If the mind remains untamed, escaping one physical reality simply drops the individual into another. Śikhidhvaja insisted to Kumbha that his renunciation was complete, citing the fact that he had left behind his wealth, his home, and his family. Kumbha argued that external sacrifice means nothing if the mind and ego, the ahamkara, remain intact. Kumbha compared this internal relinquishment to the method used by the Sakyamuni, the Buddha, to reach supreme peace. Liberation remains out of reach as long as the ego survives to take pride in its own renunciation. Śikhidhvaja finally understood. He discarded his attachment to his ascetic identity and entered a state of deep meditation. But Cūḍālā wanted to see if his realization could survive outside the quiet of the forest. She designed a series of tests to move him from static isolation into active life. In her form as Kumbha, she claimed to be cursed to become a woman at night. In this form, named Madanika, she and the king were married. She then created a magical illusion. She allowed the king to discover Madanika in the arms of a younger, more attractive male lover. This was a calculated provocation. She needed to know if his jealousy and ego were gone, or if they were merely sleeping. The king passed the test. He witnessed the infidelity and displayed no anger, maintaining his internal equilibrium and treating his wife with composure. With the king's realization confirmed, Cūḍālā dropped her disguises and returned to her original form. The text views these shifting bodies, genders, and roles as mere particles of movement within a singular field of consciousness. Recognizing their true equality, they returned to their capital, where they ruled together in peace for 10,000 years. They practiced spontaneous and natural activity, demonstrating that the world itself is a field for the expression of peace. Śikhidhvaja learned he never needed to leave his throne to find the truth. But what was the specific psychological trap that kept him imprisoned in his own mind for 18 years? And how do we avoid it? Find out in episode 13, King Śikhidhvaja's Greatest Mistake.